Welcome to TAMA Talks. Today is our last talk in the month of March, and we thank Max Presneill for joining us each week. Today, we will be joined by TAMA member Samuelle Richardson as we explore the topic of the San Francisco Bay Area artists. I'm Janine Madden, TAMA president, and this talk is being recorded and can be found on the TAMA YouTube channel. If you've missed our other talks or have been to them and want to share them with others, that's where you can find them, as well as on our website, www.tamadvocates.com. And I'll throw both of those links into the chat as well. Feel free to keep your video on if you'd like. Here comes Valerie. Feel free to keep your video on if you'd like. And if you want to keep yourself muted, you can. It does help with the background noise, but we do encourage you to break in with questions. There's a feature in Zoom where you can use your space bar to temporarily unmute yourself. And you can also raise your hand in the Zoom reactions function as well, or just, put your finger up and let us know you want to contribute. You can also put them in the chat. And so I'll be monitoring the chat. And there'll be some time at the end that we've put in for question and answers. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hey, Valerie. Good to see you.
Valerie.
A little bit about what we're going to cover today. We are going to be discussing the works of several prominent artists who shaped the San Francisco Bay Area figurative movement. Bay Area figuration grew out of the post-World War II era, when West Coast artists adapted the free use of paint in the prevailing abstract expressionist style of the period and applied it to describing forms and figures. It began around 1950 with what is now known as the San Francisco Renaissance, a term that applies most specifically to the appearance of literary geniuses, including poets, writers, and philosophers like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, but which is now applied to all artistic expressions from the Bay Area during that time. As Alan Watts aptly wrote in his autobiography, something else was on the way in religion and music and ethics and sexuality, in our attitudes toward nature, and in our whole style of life. And in the visual arts, the Bay Area figuration movement and funk art were born. In this way, the region contributed a significant new voice of painterly experimentation and zeal to the art of the times. The Bay Area figuration movement is now considered by some to be the area's most singular contribution to 20th century American art. We are going to go ahead and get started and take a look at the founders. We're going to start with the founders of the movement and their work before we get into a deeper dive with some of the artists' work with Sam today. So I will preface this by saying that Ann Weber was due to join us, and she was called away on a family emergency. So Sam's going to be doing all the heavy lifting today, and I'll help her out as much as I can. So this is one of the founders of the movement, Elmer Bischoff. And I'm going to tell you a little bit. Anne made a very good recommendation to switch to a visual slide, a painting slide, while we give you a little background about Mr. Bischoff. So according to the Hackett Mill Gallery website, as one of the first Bay Area artists to turn from abstract expressionism and surrealism works to figuration in the 1950s, Elmer Bischoff, along with his peers Richard Diewenkorn and David Park, grew dissatisfied with the limitations of the purely abstract style of painting. These artists influenced many others in San Francisco at the time, beginning what came to be known as the Bay Area figurative movement. There was, quote, "There was a definite cooling off. I can only compare it to the end of a love affair. When I was in the real grip of abstract expressionism, the marks and gestures had a hyper existence. But it was your own passion that inflamed those things, and there was just a gradual loss of that passion," Bischoff recalled. In moving toward figuration, he sought to respond to real-world places and people. As before, however, the feeling remained as an important component of Bischoff's art. He viewed painting as a vehicle for emotion rather than a formal elaboration. So we're going to look at these two pieces to begin. We have 3 pieces for each artist. Stan, do you just want to start us off on a general understanding of how the movement came about and why?
These three founders, Bischoff, Park, and Diebenkorn, were students of Clifford Still at San Francisco Art Institute, which at the time was California. I forget the name. It
That's
was
okay. She told me it will come to us.
it was a school. The school was known by another name, but is now known as San Francisco Art Institute. And Clifford Still was a very powerful figure. He was already a very well-known abstract artist and was pretty much on a pedestal. And I think his personality was really quite forceful. By the way, he was also a friend of Mark Rothko. And so these three students had studied under Still for a while. And I think Elmer Bischoff is credited for being the leader of the figurative movement. He was older than the other three, and he and Diebenkorn had served during the war, so they'd come back as mature, experienced people. And Bischoff, being older, he's given credit for being the one who broke away. Must have been, like he said, like in your quote, it was like a breakup of a love affair. I think it might have been kind of this is my sense of it, like a sense of betrayal by their esteemed instructor. So Bischoff was more assertive, and he broke away. And it's true that his work at that time began to be much more personal. If you look at the images, these are images from his personal life. And I think that was something that just wasn't being done at the time. And when his paintings became mature, he became known for his use of cool colors to suggest a scene that was awash in light. I realized when I started looking at that use of light, I also realized that the California setting itself was unique in the way that light is used in painting. So he captured that.
Okay, well, does anyone have any, we're going to try and involve you guys if you'd like. After Valerie's done chewing, we will go ahead. We will go ahead and just, anything you want to add, Max, Susan, any input? Okay, we're going to go ahead to the next image. We do have quite a few to go through today. So Man in Lavender Sky.
Looks like a self-portrait.
Okay.
Yeah. And the cool colors, and you do feel light. There's kind of a brilliant light behind him, but the colors are rather cool.
And the one thing I didn't do, which perhaps I should have, was to include I know we were looking at some of the early work, which was very figurative, but almost in a representational way. I mean, it was, those were beautifully done figures, and we chose to remove those, but I'm wondering if I'll put in a few links into the chat afterward that show some of that earlier abstract work.
He was influenced by Edward Hopper.
Yes.
And I think he wasn't the only one, but and that sense of isolation and interior. Well, this is not an interior image, but.
Yeah. But many of his works were. So we'll go through the three founders. David Park, we had mentioned in that, in the introduction. So this is a picture of David Park. And I think we put them in by age. I can't remember how we did that. So David Park was born in Boston in 1911, and interestingly was diagnosed in childhood as being more than halfway blind. He stopped wearing glasses in 1926, and he never put them on again. He moved to Los Angeles in 1928 and attended the Otis Art Institute, which was his only formal education, and he dropped out after less than a year. In 1944, he began teaching at the California School of Fine Arts, now the San Francisco Art Institute. So there you go. And adopted the then dominant mode of abstract expressionist painting under Clifford Still and Mark Rothko. In 1949, at the age of 39, he destroyed all of his abstract non-objective paintings from the 40s and began to work on what are now called his new figurative paintings. Park's abandonment of pure abstraction was fostered by, as you had mentioned earlier, a dissatisfaction with what he perceived to be the egocentric excesses of abstract expressionist artists. Thus, he introduced the style that would later be known as Bay Area figurative painting. Along with Diebenkorn, they held weekly drawing sessions in which they would each set down figures, but strictly from memory, which in turn yielded up a moody, impressionistic style of painting that was at the same time distinctly American, reminiscent, as you mentioned, of Edward Hopper. When he was 49, however, he was stricken with a fast-moving form of lung cancer, rendering him so weak that in his final 3 months, he could only work in gouache on paper, and then only when refusing his pain medication. He died in 1960. He became the first of the several Bay Area artists to reconcile thick paint and vigorous brushstrokes with figurative objects such as people engaged in contemporary everyday life. And this is Rowboat, courtesy of his estate. And this piece is on view at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth.
I heard somewhere, I read that he is considered perhaps the most iconic of the three figurative painters, original Bay Area figurative painters.
And when you say iconic, do you mean that his work is most easily identified, or?
I think, yes, I think so. That was my interpretation of that remark. It's interesting. I lived in the Bay Area for a while, and it's when you live in that area, you become kind of immersed in this figurative work because you see it everywhere. And David Park was one of the most prominent artists to be featured in exhibits and in galleries in San Francisco. And that's how I became familiar with his work. And as I'm looking at this, I'm also thinking that he and Elmer Bischoff, and perhaps Diebenkorn as well, but using what looks like the California coastline as kind of as an inspiration. You see bathers, and this light. There's a sense of light as well in here that I'm seeing.
And forgive me if this is a blurry, is this blurry on your end? It's blurry on my end, so.
A little, but
okay.
I can read it.
So the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art did a retrospective of his work back in 2020, and it just came down in January of 2021. And this piece, they highlighted several of his pieces. And as I mentioned, some of the links that I'm going to put in the chat. Again, with every single artist we've looked at, I think what I'm most fascinated by is really that progression from what they maybe started out doing to what they did in middle life, and then what they did at the end of their lives. And we've kind of explored that with all of the artists. I think it's, Anne told me Bischoff.
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 Yeah, Bischoff.
Or do you think, I did say Biscoff, like the cookie, but no. She corrected me.
No, here's a funny little, when I lived in Berkeley, there was someone who lived nearby who had an annual holiday party, and he lived in the neighborhood where Diebenkorn used to live. And one of the guests who came every year was Elmer Bischoff's widow, Adele. And so I was introduced to her, and it was definitely Bischoff.
Okay.
That's how she was introduced. I'm sure that had to be right.
Okay.
And also, Diebenkorn's son Christopher was also at that event every year. So there still exists a sort of a bond between the people from that time, even though even the second generation still has a connection.
That's always so very interesting. I think that when when there is that connection, you can speak with the the progeny of these people is very, very cool. Yeah. This piece, this Crowd of Seven, was done in the weeks before he died. And the little blurb I selected for this says it contains a septet of figures suggesting both conformity and individuality. The striking work illustrates Park's power as a human condition artist. And so I'm getting the feeling from the, from the exploring that I've been doing, but this idea of just moving from, as we go through time, just moving from what someone did to something different. And then everybody kind of building on, it seems that lots of what we've been talking about seem to build on what's been done, obviously, in the past. And picking up pieces of either going in a completely different direction or incorporating pieces of what people have done in the past. All right, the last of our founders is Richard Diebenkorn. And I have a little, I'll throw that in afterward. He was a rarity among his peers and that he was equally at home with both abstraction and representation throughout his career. I was never throwing things away when I switched from one way of painting to another, Diebenkorn stated, quote, "You can see a continuum from representation to abstraction, although I must say it never felt like a smooth transition while I was in the middle of it." His career began as an abstract painter, but around 1955, along with David Park, he began experimenting with painting subjects drawn from life in an effort to inject new energy into their abstract expressionistic canvases. With Park and Bischoff, he started painting landscape, figure, and still life subjects while maintaining abstract expressionist concerns such as those thick gestural brush strokes, an intense palette, and an emphasis on the flattened picture plane, plus launching the movement that is now referred to as Bay Area figuration. And I didn't quite understand what that flattened picture plane meant until I think looking at that abstract work, that does it just mean a lack of perspective? Like a lack of three-dimensionality, Valerie or Max or Sam?
Yeah, it's if it wasn't flattened, there would be more attention to perspective and perhaps more of a more realistic rendering of the environment, if that makes sense. But the sort of a uniform tonality in the back, I'm looking at the background, is flattened.
The fact that you said background causes this to be a dichotomy that's not easily overcome. The woman is in 3 dimensions. There is a foreground and a background, which shows perspective. So it does do those things, but I think what might be meant by this is that the planes themselves are rendered in a more flat manner. And by doing so, what that's done is it's made it very self-conscious about the canvas as a flat surface. And even though it has foreground background, particularly if you see the gray stripe that she's sitting on, it functions like a gray stripe. It works in terms of it being lighter as a horizontal surface than a vertical surface, which would be realistic, but it's rendered as if it's this completely flat beam. And what that does is it abstracts. It's still got some depth. It's got the intimations of perspective, but it essentially uses paint to function as an abstract element, which flattens that surface, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining. Valerie, did you want to add anything to that? You're good? We have the benefit of having Valerie too, because she is an artist, and so she can chime in. The sketchbook piece, Sam had me add. Tell us a little bit about that sketchbook collection. I was really intrigued by just the image of all the different sketchbooks. Yes,
there are 26 sketchbooks. I think there are over 1,000 images contained in these sketchbooks. He was an avid user of his sketchbook, and I also understand that he drew from live models, and then his paintings were made from the drawings of his live models. many painters use live models in the studio and they paint from the model, but Diebenkorn was in the habit of using his
Oh,
drawings.
sorry.
He used his also people from his everyday life as subjects. And this is his wife, Phyllis, in this drawing, who was also his muse. And you see, I believe I'm seeing her turn up in many of his famous paintings. There's this one that has this enormous sun hat, and it's a very famous, that might even be the title, the hat, is something woman with a hat. And I'm convinced it had to be his wife. Yeah, so like his peers, he was using his personal life as a source of inspiration and subject matter.
So in this piece, I have a little note here that just says ladies. So I'm not sure if this is what Anne was going to speak about. Do you recall Anne's relationship with this artist? Did she meet him, or was it more that she was
No.
in that Viola Frey?
Viola Fry was the
Fry.
person she studied under. And
Okay.
Diebenkorn, he died in '93. And I believe Anne she must have just been wrapping up her master's degree at CCA at that time.
Okay.
So I don't think that she would have met him.
Okay.
Anyway, this to me is a very typical Diebenkorn piece. If you saw it, you would know it was Diebenkorn because the way he uses shape and flattens the shape. I'm wondering if this is a piece in gouache, or if you know the medium, because he worked really well in gouache, watercolor, oil, concha crayon, printmaking. He worked really well in so many mediums.
I will get it for you.
I'm just curious because it
paste
has
it,
a
but I
kind of
will.
look to it, as like it might be from gouache or watercolor. Yes.
Max? Oh, Max, you're muted. Max,
Mute.
there you go.
Well, I think what's interesting about this image is that when Sam said about working from the sketchbooks, that process of working from the sketchbooks allows you to see it flat and to abstract away from, and take out things, because it's very easy to get too involved with stuff that's right in front of you when you're painting from life. But if you put it down on paper, it's very easy to then start blocking into the basic rhythms that you need rather than the reality. And I think what's interesting here is the woman's seated, but she's not seated on anything. There's still the intimations of perspective, because those black tiles, but the chair itself seems to be entirely removed, which is enables you to just focus on the figure. And doesn't kind of distract between the figure and this implied space. And I think it's really interesting, because then it starts getting, again, so it's figurative artwork, but it's engaging with this dialogue with abstraction in a meaningful way.
And the palette's interesting too, like that use of the purple and the yellow and the complementary colors. And this is not the only painting of his called Seated Woman, but one that came up that's very, very similar in palette and brush stroke is gouache on poster board, I think it said. But I will definitely find that original one for you. And we are going to move on to Viola Fry. So I put down here that Marge will talk about this slide as was she the student of Marge Levy?
Yes, Anne Weber was a student of Marge Levy. I think when Anne saw this picture in our meeting, she was amazed, because she said, the person who took this picture of Viola was in fact her instructor also at Purdue. Of course, at Purdue, because that's their classroom. And years later, I know that I think that Anne left the East Coast to go to study at CCA. It was at CCAC at the time, California College of Art and Craft. which now it's California College of the Arts. But she wanted to study with Viola Fry. Anne had been a ceramic artist and wanted to go to study with Fry because Fry in her career was a ceramic artist, but wanted to pursue ceramics as fine art without the function of craft. And at that time, it was a new idea in that world. And I think that was why Anne moved to Oakland to study with her.
Well, let's learn a little bit more about her. So she was born on August 15th, 1933 in Lodi, California. And she was raised on her family's vineyard. When she was 11, she submitted a rendition of a Matisse drawing for an exhibition at the Sacramento Public Library and was excited when it was accepted. However, as she later reflected in her 1995 interview for the Archives of American Art, even at the age of 11, she realized the point was not to draw like Matisse, but to draw like yourself. In 1955, she received her undergraduate degree in painting at CCAC in Oakland. And in 1960, she moved to San Francisco, where figurative art and working with clay were the vanguard. During this period, she produced functional pottery, which is, I think, is that primarily what Anne's works in?
Yes. Yeah.
Wall plates and ceramic sculpture, in addition to continuing a vigorous painting and drawing practice that focused on still life, landscape, and figural compositions. In 1965, she purchased a Victorian house and converted the basement into her first studio. She began teaching a color and light class in the painting department at CCAC. She continued to teach, traveling to France and moving several times. In 1997, she was diagnosed with cancer and died just shy of her 71st birthday in 2004. So if we look at these pieces, the self-portrait is pastel on paper, and that was done in 1993. And the family portrait are ceramics, ceramic and glazes. And this piece is actually as part of the collection of the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., which I have to say, whenever we go to Washington, D.C., I always try and go into the gardens. It's beautiful. And I'm a big fan of I don't know if you've ever been, but I'm a big fan of the Liechtenstein moving house. So if you walk at it at a certain angle and then you walk by, it appears to pivot. And I just think that that's cool. So, so looking at these pieces, so the pastel on paper, I find this as a self-portrait to be so engaging, just because it's just that the figure is there, but she's looking in different directions, and there's figures in the background and figures on top of figures, and then the rooster, and I just find it amazing.
This is an amazing self-portrait. It's how old was she when I'm just 93.
Let me go back. Yeah, so 33 to, yeah.
Yeah, so she was a mature artist by then. Yeah, that was interesting to know that she was determined to turn away from the functionality, and she's associated with this robust, and you even see it in the drawing, this robust expressionistic style in her work. And one thing that Anne brought out in our meeting was that her glazing looks like abstract painting, and that was an interesting distinction.
On this piece here.
Yeah, and you do see it in this. Yeah, this is a good example, I think, of the abstract. Her glazing wasn't so literal. It was more of an intuitive, gestural painting, like the expressionist painters of that time. Maybe this is a good time to mention it for people who live in the LA area. If you're in Pasadena, there's a wonderful, this one. Yeah, this is a wonderful piece. It's if you're on Colorado Boulevard in Old Pasadena and you find the Patagonia store, I think that's on Fair Oaks, there's a courtyard behind those stores, and this is a public art piece that I've been looking at it for years. I love to, if I'm in that area, I always go into the courtyard so I can enjoy this. It's huge. It's a big, gigantic.
I have feet by 4 feet is
Yeah,
the measurement that I have. And the location is Smith Alley, 1 West Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena.
yes.
I think the idea of public art is extraordinary. And I have been very lucky to live in communities where they have robust public art showing. And soon, Torrance will be one of those areas where we are looking at putting up a large amount of public art this summer. And stay tuned for more information on that. But absolutely, I think that it's really interesting when you see sometimes when we lived in California and we would go up to Las Vegas, one of my hunting was always for those pieces of public art that are there in that Las Vegas area that I always wanted to, I would drag Dave around and say, there's a Frank Stella or whatever it happened to be. And so hunting out public art, there are some websites out there, I think, that just show you wonderful pieces of public art that are right there in your backyard. So again, I do wish maybe we can figure out a time to have Anne back at some point, because I really would love to hear her experiences of spending time with this artist directly, right? She worked with her directly.
Yes, when she was a student, Viola Fry was her mentor and was a graduate student. What was it that she said that Viola had this idea that you should be a good enough instructor, but not so good that you gave up all of your time and energy to your students, because she wanted to keep enough for herself and for her work. So she was a little bit of a reluctant mentor with students. I remember something else about Anne saying that she wasn't passive with her students, ironically, was not passive, because she would say to them that they had to learn how to think like artists. And I think in the medium of ceramics, there's a tendency to just kind of do traditional shapes and traditional craft. And she would push people away and say, you have to think like an artist. And to me, that sounds like, that's a valuable influence from any instructor.
Do you feel the same, Max? Do you kind of advise? I know that you have some work experience in that area. So do you feel similarly?
I think that one of the, as an ex-university professor, I think one of the difficulties is trying to establish for younger artists particularly is that thinking about painting and thinking about illustration are two different things. They're different ways of interpreting the world, and they're different processes. And that difference is the same between sculpture and craft. Trying to get someone to understand that you're not even standing side by side. One's over in the distance and one's over here, and they rarely kind of just the only crossover really is the materials. And that has very little to do with content and your aims and mission as an artist. And I think that it's a really, really hard lesson to learn for most students. So any instructors, professors that are any good at helping transition, because most people start in the craft, because all kids do craft, and all kids can tend to think about illustrating because this means this. And trying to move out of those really simplistic relationships between image and form and materials it's one of the hardest things I think for younger artists to learn. And so it's always welcome to hear that somebody was actually good at it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you just made me think of another TAMA talk, although we're ramping up hopefully and opening at the museum. But at some point, I would love to be able to have a panel of just different artists and curators and folks like you who could advise those young artists, almost like the portfolio reviews that you were doing a while ago. I think we did them a couple of years ago or maybe longer. But I think that one of the most important things that these talks try and do is give that kind of different perspective, and then also just pique the curiosity of those who are attending to look further into the art that we're talking about. There's so many images that we could choose for some of these artists, but we just have such a limited amount of time. And so I'm gonna try and keep moving on, and also put a few more links in the chat for you guys to Click on. Interestingly enough, this entire TAMA talk came out of the suggestion from Sam to go ahead and focus on the work of Joan Brown and Manuel Neri. And she sent me quite a few images, and the fact that they were artists in their own right, I'll go through them one by one just to make it easier. Joan Brown, born in 1938, was a central figure in the post-war Bay Area painting scene. She was a member of a second generation of Bay Area figurative movement painters who created an intensely autobiographical and idiosyncratic body of work that explores human nature, animal instinct, and social mores through the use of humor, myth, and fantasy. In 1961, she returned from her sojourn in Europe and embarked on an immensely charged period of creativity in response to her reflections upon what she had seen and experienced. This period also marked the beginning of her transition away from abstract works toward an emphasis on figurative imagery. Her interest grew to include an appreciation for the Eastern use of flattened perspective, line, and intense colors to describe the figure, rather than the Western way of modulation. And I'll probably have you speak on that because I'm not quite sure I understand what they mean by that word in that sentence. Collectively seen, works from this period are distinguished not only by a strong emphasis on figurative imagery, but also a brilliant sense of dramatic light and opulent application of pigment. Sorry, I should have been on that slide. And so these, I added I had a different piece in here and I had a difficulty finding some provenance for it. So I changed this, and then also this plays into a little bit more that I wanted to share about her that I learned. I was reading that in 1990, she traveled to India to help with an installation of one of her obelisks. And the concrete turret from the floor above collapsed on her and two other people, killing them at this Eternal Heritage Museum in India. And so I thought, what a dreadful way to die, although you're there sort of, immersed in your life's work. And that was in October of 1990. So Sam, you had offered up some of the work. Now, some of the recommendation for us to cover her today.
I think that she's an interesting figure in the Bay Area figurative movement for a couple of reasons. She was, I can't think of another woman painter of that time who has, has stood the test of time. There probably is somebody, but I can't recall who would have been as strong an artist as she was. I think it's interesting, however, she, I think her career was enhanced a great deal by her partnership with Manuel Neri, and that happened very early, as they were both students of Elmer Bischoff.
Correct.
At San Francisco Art Institute. So now here we go, next generation leading into the next one. And then she and Neri shared a studio in San Francisco with some other artists, but they worked together a lot. And you really, in their earlier work, which is before this, you really see the influence the influence they had on each other. And they only stayed together 4 years, but there was quite a productive time for both of them during those 4 years. She then, because of being this powerful person that she was, continued to, and this is early, actually this is interesting, this is one of her earliest pieces, and this is of her son who she had with Neri, and this is obviously a domestic scene of her personal life. So she was also among the Bay Area painters who painted from personal life, and in an exuberant, uninhibited way. I think after this time, she became involved in some Eastern spirituality, hence the obelisk, and she did make obelisks as public art. I think there is even one in San Diego in downtown San Diego, and I'm forgetting, it's near one of the major shopping areas, so but when she was a painter, she painted a lot of her personal life. As you can see from the previous slides, they became more flattened and more influenced by Eastern art and spirituality. I'm looking at her riding the tiger, and that has to be, Ride the Tiger is definitely from Eastern spirituality.
Yes, and again, I will find a better link to put in there, but I recognize that, the biographies of the folks of the artists that we're covering are absolutely extensive. And so this piece, is at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So I'll put a link to that in there. But you had mentioned that she did include her son Noel in quite a lot of her work. And then it was the picture that I removed, unfortunately, was the one with her and the cat. I had a really hard time trying to find that to be attributed to her. So, and I couldn't really tell. That one of the things that's interesting about images is that unless they come up on a site with some really good documentation, there's a lot of people painting in the style as these artists, and also Pinterest is just overflowing with people's work in the style of. So so I did switch that one out. And then the work that I have, you had mentioned the work that I have for Manuel Neri, who is actually still alive.
He is, he lives in Benicia, California, which is it's on the east side of the bay, up a little north of that, north of Berkeley. He really flourished at that time when he joined with Joan Brown and formed their studio. I believe he's mostly known for his figurative sculpture. He did figurative painting. They look to me, his paintings look an awful lot like studies to me, but he used plaster in a way that allowed him to build up and subtract which is very much like an expressionistic approach to painting. And those forms were also added. He had added color, I think, oftentimes with enamel paint, and so that his figures have this sort of ravaged appearance like classical Greek sculpture, but the enamel paint gives it this kind of a feeling of vitality, kind of a fresh, modern feeling of vitality. I have always been a fan of his work. It's just something, I think sometimes when there's something missing in a figure, it's more compelling. So I don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the glaze work too, I think, is really very interestingly done and very beautiful. And again, I think I'm going to start to try and maybe just pick up some of the images and like put them on our Facebook or something so people can take a look at them a little more closely. But as you had said, he met Joan Brown when they were both taking a painting class with Elmer Bischoff. And I think, as you mentioned too, that they were both married to two different people at the time. And so they did have a romantic and artistic partnership. And she became a frequent study of his figure studies, as you had mentioned.
So really, these are interesting, I think, because this is a recurring thing in sculpture, is a kind of return to classicism. And these are, he can't possibly not be completely aware of ancient Greek sculpture from Cycladic figures, which were sticks with circles for head, essentially, with little, like a nose indicated. And then I think they're called curi, which are the figures that would be standing up, the hands by the sides and the feet together. And then we also see that in Egyptian sculpture, where then the foot takes one step forward. and then and you know, things do, and then suddenly there's this blooming in classical sculpture in Greece, and three-dimensional, very dynamic sculptural forms of the figure. But I think there's this tradition, including Roman. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting the names. There's Roman sculptures that were basically a column that would have a head or something at the top of them, which were, I believe, to fight off evil spirits, and they would have been outside of the homes of people. So there's this really long tradition of having this like object head, and I think it's really interesting that in sculpture you see this kind of cycles of going back to that real referencing into that classical period, because you can't not do this and not know about that classical period and be influenced by it. I mean, I can't see how that would be possible, really. And the titles have that feeling. I don't know what I can't say what that means. I don't know. But they have that kind of reference in the same way as, say, Twombly and some other artists through their titles kind of reference more classical forms.
I'm quickly Googling at the same time, but you are right. So it is, my brain isn't working fast enough to get that, but yes. And so like, for instance, this, what do I have here? Hold, about Joan Brown seated. Okay, so he began making life-size sculptures like Joan Brown seated, which we'll see in just a minute, but the words are on this slide. And he shaped the original sculpture in plaster, an inexpensive material he liked for speed and ease with which it could be worked and reworked. And then the surface of the figure is rich with the marks of the artist's hand and tools, coated with his signature white patina. This unique aluminum cast, his first metal casting, preserves the look and tactility of the plaster, original in the medium meant to last. Let me get to that piece. Oh, there you go. And again, would you say this has a lack of arms? Or are they just incorporated in? It's hard to not get a lovely 3D look of this. This is from Stanford also, I think, where his notebooks are.
I think that these things do this weird thing between the figure and abstraction. Again, it's as much about an abstraction as it is about the figure. It's about a dynamic sculptural shape. It's about the, this kind of form altogether. Whether it has, I mean, it looks like it doesn't have arms, and essentially it doesn't matter. I mean, it does inadvertently, well, no, it deliberately will reference ancient sculpture. How can it not? I mean, you can't possibly do art for any length of time without being aware of these precedents. And they do seem very, very classical to me. This looks like the work of somebody who visits museums.
It's interesting. It's it says aluminum with, and I don't know what this is, albarada patina with oil-based pigments, using oil-based pigments with yellow glaze. And it was cast originally in 1963, and then the patina was reapplied in 2016. And this is at Stanford, something in the Anderson collection. So again, just a kind of piquing of the curiosity. I'll throw some links for some of the videos onto our Facebook page after the talk is done. But a very interesting look at these artists from the San Francisco Bay Area, and the fact that it's just a plane ride up for you in Los Angeles. It's really very interesting to me that several of the museums in Northern California are exhibiting the work of these artists. Max?
There's a couple of thoughts come to mind about this because I remember clearly my first introductions to Bay Area figuration. There are a couple of things. One is that outside that original three, I don't think you can really, it's not, the rest of them aren't part of that movement. It was a culturally specific time and place. The rest of them wouldn't be, and I think they wouldn't like to be held as Bay Area figurative artists just because they're in the Bay Area and they make figurative art because that it actually is a movement as such. I mean, there was a lot of people at the time that saw this. I think it's also important to realize that historically, it's kind of been reassessed because at the time, and for a long time, by many people, it would have been seen as retrograde and reactionary, and very, very provincial. Now, I think that would have been common. I know it was a common way of interpreting what these artists' work for a long time. I think it helped that over a period of time, their influence seeped outwards, because it didn't for an awfully long time. Because look, figuration's never gone away. It's not like they discovered figuration. It's not like they were the only people working in figuration against the norms. In any given time, figuration is the norm. Even when abstract expressionism was at its strongest, the norm was still figurative painting.
Okay.
It's just that there's a certain attention given to the abstract expressionists. But that doesn't mean everybody was working in that mode at all by any means. And I think it's important to recognise that one is to recognise how it would have been seen in its own context, and second of all is that is to understand that there has been a reassessment of those artists over the years. They've become more important and more influential over time, particularly Diedenkorn. And I think it's interesting that we can it's easier now to reassess them without the prejudices that were around for this kind of art, and it's easier to do it now than it would have been at the time, because provincialism isn't necessarily a negative in the ways that it was for an awfully long time. We can look at Chicago art and talk about a lot of art that was from that area at given times and not kind of snigger. And the same thing with San Francisco, because it was always New York and then sometimes LA. Those are developments that are recent, though. I think it's important to.
Yeah, this slideshow or this talk had several iterations. I had at one point figurative movement in there, and then I just changed it to the San Francisco Bay Area artists. I'm not sure. I will double check and see how I put it on this slide. Yeah, I put figurative movement artists here and the San Francisco Bay artists there. So it went through several iterations, realizing as I was researching it that not all of the artists fit into that particular. And now after last week, I'm very, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm very observant of when I was reading that part earlier about this San Francisco Renaissance or whatever, I said it with a smile because I recognize that, what society is calling a movement doesn't necessarily resonate with the artists that participate in that quote unquote movement. I'm learning, so yeah. And also you were mentioning how the artists over time get reassessed, and I think Basquiat sort of falls into that category too, and other artists too, I think, whose work gets, obviously, I think that it was the Basquiat just a few days ago that went for like $41 million or something, and that idea that an artist's work, when we look at it outside of the time that it's created, and I think the Impressionists went through this. I think there's a lot of artists whose careers were not necessarily looked at with the reverence that they are maybe now through the eyes of the art buying public or art appreciating public.
I think what would be a really interesting thing to take away from this, as a kind of mental exercise, is to try and find a way of understanding what makes Bay Area figuration, particularly of those first three, any different from, and in what ways is it different from the figuration that would have been going on throughout the 20th century? In what exact ways is it actually different? I understand that there's this kind of, well, we're doing this thing that isn't abstract expressionism, but that is by no means isolated. You can find that in New York, you can find it in London, you can find it in Paris, you can find it in art centers all around the world, with people continuing with with figurative works and incorporating aspects of abstraction, which even as far back as the original expressionists were doing. So trying to find like what is the difference between these and besides more, you know, the German expressionists in the early 20th century, and they tended to use really harsh, like jagged lines, etc., as a way of emotionally growing the image, you know, giving it more impact in some ways, which the Bay Area figurative don't. Like San Francisco, of course, they don't. But I think it'd be interesting if we're looking a little harder, is to find, well, is there different applications of paint? Is there different ways of structuring the backgrounds? Not to compare them with the German expressionists, but to compare them with other figurative painters during the 20th century, when all of them, absolutely all of them, could not have been at least influenced by abstraction. Because, I mean, you can either go totally against it, or you can incorporate elements, but you can't ignore it. And so it'd be interesting to find out why is this painting Bay Area as opposed to New York? I don't know, I have no answers for any of these, by the way. I just think it'd make an interesting sort of academic exercise to kind of identify exactly how and why this is true.
One of the artists that we chose to exclude, and not for any other reason other than the fact that he chose not to be associated with really any movement, particularly the Bay Area figurative movement, was Wayne Thiebaud. And I had a lot of his work in here. We cut it for, we all sort of agreed that we cut it because of his written down desire not to be included in it. But I will say that his work, they talked about the verticality of it. His work had a lot of, so he's well known for his, you know, he does the pies and pastries and cakes and lollipops and gumballs, but he also has a very, I'll put one in the Facebook page, some extraordinary work of cityscapes and these large buildings with winding roads and like Lombard Street, and after what you're saying, it may be, and I'm wondering if maybe the provinciality of it is what sets them apart, just the idea that they were all sort of in this, all in San Francisco at the same time creating similar work. And I don't know why my brain is going to the Blue Riders, because a part of me thinks not for their thoughts of, you know, they obviously were the Blue Rider group, as we learned with the Kandinsky piece, they were responding to something. And it sounds like this group of artists perhaps was responding to something similar, but just not in such a worldly sense, and maybe more just an artistic sense. But I'm with you, Max. I do not know.
Yeah, I mean, even just by saying Blue Riders, it becomes apparent like there's a difference in the idea of imagination and the everyday as an opposition, for example. But the everyday, of course, had been incorporated into art since the 1800s by some artists. So that wouldn't define it in some ways, and trying to find ways, not that you have to define it by any means, just as, like I said, an academic exercise in trying to find what those specifics might be would be an interesting rabbit hole to run down for a while. If anybody kind of likes this work enough to do that.
And I think you hit on a very valid point, which is I think all of the artists that we have showcased in the talks we've done resonate with some people for some reason, whether it's a brushstroke or application of paint or the subject matter or whatever it might be. I think the key is being able to, you know, that the internet is just full of rabbit holes. It is the hyperlinking world of rabbit holes. And Sam and I were chatting about this idea that when I was putting this together, you know, there's a click every other word, and I just click them. And so, you know, at some point you have 55 tabs open and you're trying to remember, you know, what's out there. And it's just the amount of both visual and written information is so vast and can be so overwhelming. But for those who want to learn about it, I can't even tell you how many webinars and classes and talks that I've been able to click into these last 6 months or so from museums all over the world and all over the country that just have artists talking about their exhibition or whatever it might be. And that's what I find so fascinating about this. So, you know, it's just another place for your mind to go while you are waiting for your vaccine.
I must admit, I'm really happy we did this. So it's good to see Parks work again, because it's not somebody I look at regularly, but I admire. I prefer Diebenkorn's abstracts personally.
Yes, so we were going to put one in. His are more, they're very, I don't want to say geometric, but they're less. The reason why we didn't put those in is because they really weren't figurative, but they're really extraordinary. I really enjoyed looking at those. So I'll throw a few of those up into Facebook too.
You know, and you know, just as an aside, Neary's work has gone through periods of being seen quite a lot in Los Angeles, and it's been one of those things that has been in the past so present with shows in Los Angeles that I think a lot of people didn't know he was an older artist.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because what did we say? I don't know. You know what? I think I maybe only put, oh no, I did. Hold on. Or maybe I didn't. I didn't put it on the slide, but he was born in 1930. So yeah, and Wayne Thiebaud. Wayne Thiebaud is just turned 100 in November of 2020. So
he gets lumped in with pop art often, which is
he does, and he
Yeah.
eschews that as well. He doesn't want to be associated with that as well. His work is even just in picking out the landscape pieces or the cityscape pieces for what was in this show or in this slideshow. The use of line and color, and it was just really extraordinary to learn more about.
He's a great painter. Like, he uses paint so you actually want to eat those cakes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's something. I mean, they're really luscious, but I way prefer his landscapes, because I don't really personally have much time for. I feel like the pies and cakes and everything are so lightweight. They're excellently painted. I mean, they're wonderfully painted, but I find them so lightweight as to be, yeah. Whereas I think the landscapes, because they play with abstraction in this really strange way, because there's much to do with what he's seeing as much to do with what he's leaving out very deliberately, and you know, the playing with angles. I mean, they're completely impossible, you know, as views and real views, and I think he does that really, really well.
Yes, I will. I'll throw a few onto the Facebook page too, just to kind of these talks can go on because, like you said, they just morph into a discussion about art, which was their intention. Next week. So thank you. I kept Anne's name in here. But next, oh, thank you. I was looking up C and I couldn't find it, and this makes sense.
I think that's the spelling. I mean, look,
okay.
It's been a while. I think that's how you spell it.
Kouri. Okay, I'll look up that. Our next TAMA talk is going to be on April 2nd, so next Friday, and Jason's going to join us. Is his title Outreach Coordinator? Outreach.
He's either outreach coordinator or social media specialist. I can never remember.
Okay, well, he does a fantastic job with social media. He's been posting all of the Hobson's Choice and actually everything that TAMA has been doing. Jason's been posting it, and I think Hobson's Choice too was the last week. Was this last week for that? I think he put a little note.
We're stopping doing that now.
Okay. He is going to join us to give us a perspective on how the art scene has been affected. The LA art scene has been affected by COVID, and also some news about the upcoming, what's happening at TAM, what's coming up. He'll probably tell us a little bit about what's happening with the public art show in Torrance this summer, and a possible pop-up that's going to maybe happening as well. Fingers crossed, we're not sure when. And then on April 9th, for our last TAMA talk for a while, Max will lead the discussion about the work of, and I say UK-based artist Fiona Ray. Is that an appropriate moniker or?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll get the Evite out to Jason's after this talk. Like I said, the museum does have a significant quantity of virtual work available online on their website, www.torranceartmuseum.com. And so thank you, really, everyone, for coming today. I really appreciate it. I'll go ahead and put the, I'll put a link to the, I'll edit this and then I'll put a link to it in the, on our YouTube page so that you can look back. Oh, there you go.
Sorry,
Kate, oh,
I got it
that's
wrong.
okay. No, it's fine. It's one of the detriments of sharing my screen is that I am unable to quickly Google while we are, thanks, Valerie, quickly able to Google the terminology and some of the images that we talked about. So appreciate you showing up and we look forward to seeing everybody next week.